Good afternoon. Hopefully you found lunch. If you're like me, you ran into many friends and colleagues, too many to have lunch with. So hopefully you'll meet others and plan your coffee breaks around the meeting time. My name is Roger Griffiths. I'm the Climate Change Coordinator for NOAA's Fisheries Service, and it's a great pleasure to be here with so many friends and colleagues. I don't know if you're like me, but the morning session got me thinking a lot. And I want to thank the presenters this morning, both in the plenary and the breakouts, for setting the context for this important two-day meeting. It's an honor to be here to serve as moderator for this next session. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers. And I wanted to reflect a bit as I was flying in last night. I had about a 12-hour turnaround from my flight from Taipei, Taiwan, then to turn around and come here. And so I'm not exactly sure what time zone I'm on, but it doesn't really matter. I was reflecting on when this gentleman by the name of Dan Ash, who I'm sure many of you know, current director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, he came to NOAA a couple years ago, and he had this very interesting idea about developing a series of landscape scale cooperatives. And he basically made the pitch that not only with our current conservation challenges did we need to take broader approaches, but in fact in a changing climate and a changing world, we needed a whole new way of approaching things and working together. And so it's been impressive to watch, from my personal perspective and professional perspective, to watch not only the birth, but the growth and early development of the LCCs and the LCC network. And it's just a great pleasure to be here in this important stage in your development. I also want to say that NOAA is very pleased to be part of this effort. We're committed to continuing to participate and helping support this effort as it moves forward. This morning, the plenaries and the breakouts highlighted many of the key needs, challenges, and opportunities for conservation of natural and cultural resources in this time of change. And I'll just tick off a couple of them for context for this next session, that we're in the age of new normals. Stationarity is no longer the framework within which we can think about our jobs. That natural systems are already responding both to climate change, but in the context of the existing stressors that they're already under. And that climate-smart conservation really is our challenge. I'm going to go to the analogy that Bruce Stein used of how do we cook in this new climate. There are some key recipes, and part of, I think, the major opportunity and role of the LCCs is to help us see those new recipes and approaches as we go forward. And then, of course, there's the secret sauce, the intentionality about adaptation. And lastly, that scale absolutely matters. We've known that scale matters, but it matters even more in a changing climate. Temporal scale, thinking across timelines, spatial scales, very important. But I'll add another scale, which is the partnership development or dimension, that we really can't tackle these challenges nearly as well as we need to without coming together and working together in a coordinated, much more coordinated way. So that really is context for what this session is all about. This session is focusing on the potential and the critical need for existing programs to work with the LCCs and with each other, that dimension of partnerships and collaboration. We have 4 distinguished speakers, and I think I'll introduce them as we go. And our first speaker is Deputy Secretary Hayes. He's the second highest ranking official at the Department of the Interior, and this is actually his second run as Deputy Secretary. And I had the great pleasure of both watching him work and working with him during the Clinton administration in that role. He serves as the department's chief operating officer. He has authority over all the department's bureaus and agencies. He's involved in implementing the Secretary's priorities for many, and if not all, the mission areas. And throughout his career, he's been involved in developing progressive solutions to environmental and natural resource challenges. And I have, after watching his staff, chased after him. I know that he's very hard to keep up with, but he's been an inspiration for many of us for many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That was a very nice introduction. I am a recidivist. I'm back again. You know, it's okay to do the crime once, but to do it twice. I feel very fortunate, actually, to be back in public service and working with so many of you. And I want to talk today for a few minutes about landscape conservation cooperatives, because it's been in the forefront of what Ken Salazar and I and others in the administration have been pushing from day one with the Obama administration as a new approach to conservation. And I truly believe that we are at a watershed moment here when we have the opportunity to have this landscape conservation cooperative concept take hold. You know, the traditional way of dealing with conservation is the interior way, which is stovepipes. We've got lots of stovepipes. You know, we kind of think we're the big dog. We've got the National Park Service, we got the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we've got the Bureau of Land Management, we've got BIA and the tribes, we've got the USGS, our neighbors, the Forest Service, and the National Resource Conservation System. You know, all told, we control 1/3 of the land mass of the United States, and the traditional view is we do that very well, thank you very much. We've got this figured out. We got these big land masses, and all of our little stovepipes have a little bit of a different way to do things, but that's okay. You know, Congress gave us a little bit of a different direction if you're from the Forest Service or BLM or the Park Service, and we're very proud of these distinctions, by the way, and our different uniforms and everything else. And that's okay. This has worked pretty well. We've got all these cool places that you can go see. We got happy wildlife prancing around, and so what's the problem? Well, it's not working anymore. And we saw some of the glimmers of this in the 90s when we started to realize that we had some major landscape level needs that we had to address. And so we started doing some ad hoc things across the administration and with states and with partners. We've been doing it for a number of years in the Chesapeake Bay. We've been doing it in the Everglades. We've been doing it in California's Bay Delta. We've started to recognize, and sort of everyone gets it, that there are some landscapes that have special needs, that are crying out for help. And in those landscapes, we have found that the big dog, take your pick, whoever you want to pick as the big dog, can't do it by themselves. The only way to do it is in partnership, and it is in cooperation, and it's hard. It requires a lot of work together, a lot of science together, but if you amass the resources, you can do great things on a landscape. Well, as we came into the administration, we were motivated, I personally was motivated, by a special concern of climate change on our resources. Here we are at the Department of the Interior, the largest resource manager in the United States, and our resources are being affected by climate change. And the impact goes way beyond those stovepipes. By definition, you're talking about changes in the hydrologic cycle that affect a large region. Yes, Yellowstone is big, but it's not big enough to look at the impacts in that region. The Colorado River Basin, the impacts are affecting the whole region. So what is the way to deal with how to address these impacts that are landscape level in nature? Sam Hamilton, who was our first director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, who passed away tragically now a year and a half ago or so, I think it was actually about a year ago, because we just named Congress named a national wildlife refuge for him a few weeks ago at the 1-year anniversary of his death. He brought to Ken Salazar and me the concept of landscape conservation cooperatives, which grew out of the joint venture success for the migratory bird community. And he said, you know, this is more than climate change, but this is a vehicle, potentially, for landscape level work. And it's different. It's different than the normal way. And what are the key distinctions? Why is it different? Well, the idea is that you set the table and you get all resource managers and stakeholders in the region around the table. And guess what? Nobody tells anyone else what they have to do. Nobody runs the show. You're there to talk about shared interests in that region for conservation. And the benchmark is you start with science and with data. And around that table, you share information so everyone knows what's happening to the resources of concern in that region. And for some LCCs, that's enough. You're providing data to everybody, and folks can make their own decisions, and they're going to be better decisions. For other regions, you may go farther. You have the potential for coordinated decision-making. So if adaptation is needed to deal with a climate threat or another resource threat, you provide the opportunity for coordinated action across the landscape, beyond the stovepipe. And what we discovered after we launched this, and we pushed very hard in year one for big budget money for this, and we got $100 million for the combination of LCCs and climate science centers through the U.S. Geological Survey. And I will say every year we have fought for this, and we have gotten between $60 and $100 million we have been investing in the Department of the Interior in this program because we see the opportunities that it provides and what we believe that it's the blueprint for how to do conservation in the future. Okay, so all of that said, we need to face up to some challenges that we face here in the LCC world. And I want to offer to you my thoughts on what those challenges are. And then I'm going to give you some ideas on what I think we need to do together to respond to those challenges. What are the challenges? First, let's be frank. There's a lack of clarity about the mission and the deliverables that we can and should expect from LCCs. We don't have a common elevator speech. If I took 20 of you outside and one by one we talked about what LCCs mean to each of you, we'd get 20 different answers. Now, one answer is, well, these are decentralized, these are democratically arranged tables. Of course there is not a commonality. We're going to have different approaches in different regions. Well, yes, but we need more clarity. Second challenge. In some locations, LCCs have not yet been embraced by the leadership of key players in the region. Your state wildlife directors may or may not be into your LCCs. Your regional director of your siloed agency may or may not think that LCCs have a lot to offer. Local tribes may be wondering what these things really are. Some stakeholders may be at the table, others are wondering what it's all about. And a number of these folks may have no skin in the game. They're happy to come to an LCC meeting because the Fish and Wildlife Service budget has provided a facilitator and maybe a science person, and they're handing out some science money, but there's no skin in the game by others, and will this be around 5 years from now? And what's the third challenge? And it is funding. It's funding and skin in the game. But don't get discouraged. The reality is there is a compelling case for this architecture of landscape conservation cooperatives to take hold. We need to do two things, and they are, first, we do need to agree on some basic principles for the system as a whole. Being decentralized does not mean chaotic. It does not mean that we don't have shared understandings and expectations. We can and we should have those. And then secondly, we need to relentlessly work together to apply those principles, demonstrate success, get high-level buy-in from your boss and from their boss, and turn to the LCCs. Get folks throughout your organizations. Think about the LCCs first as a place to go to deal with conservation priorities. Okay, so that's easy to say, those two things. All right, we need some basic principles. We need to work together to apply those principles. Give us, Hayes, be a little more specific here. What are the keys to success for LCCs? How can we build on the foundation that's already exhibited in this room and that reflects the excitement that many of us have for the LCC concept? I'm going to offer 5 keys to success. First, focus on the sharing of science. If that's all that LCCs do, that may be enough. This is huge. The traditional approach to conservation is that pick your siloed agency, federal, state, your siloed NGO, tribe. Everyone kind of sees the conservation needs through their own prism, through their own mandate, develop their own science, look to their own sources of information, and it stays there. The LCC concept provides the place where all the resource managers in a region can get around the table and say, okay, what do we got? What are the resources we're most concerned about? Who's got the best science on it? We've got some money. What should we be spending our money on? Where are the gaps? Where's the science that's going to help us as decision makers make good decisions on what to do in our region for conservation? If we can get that right, that is huge, because good science is the basis for good conservation and good decision making. And right now, there is no place across the country on a regularized basis to share this kind of basic conservation information among all the many players who need to be involved in making decisions. Second key to success, LCCs need to be relevant. You need to focus on issues that are important to the managers and the resource managers in your region. You know, there's a temptation for LCCs, for any opportunity like this, to focus on the issues du jour, the issues that the folks around the table think are most interesting and important. And that's fine if you've got the capacity to do it. But LCCs will prove their worth and their roots will grow if they address issues that are relevant to the resource managers and the populations in a region. That means with sage grouse on the table, LCCs are helping to address the sage grouse issues. In the Gulf Coast, LCCs are working on recovery issues because that's in the here and now. In the Colorado River Basin, it's water issues. In the desert, it's the siting of major renewable energy projects. Across the landscape, it's America's great outdoors. It is what is on the minds of resource managers. What are the conservation pressures and opportunities facing that region today? If you focus on those things, you will be relevant, and you will get the state director, you will get the regional Fish and Wildlife Service director at your meetings and involved. Third, don't try to do too much. This is really important. You know, gosh, what an opportunity. You've got everyone around the table. You're in a region that's rich with conservation challenges. Let's take it all on. That will be a disaster. Stick to what you can do. And when I say don't take on too much, LCCs should be, to me, the place, maybe it's the clearinghouse, all right? There are always going to be, take sage grouse, there are always going to be special initiatives that are going to have to develop their own clique of people around them that are going to spend full time on those issues. Okay? The same thing for America's Great Outdoors. Any number of issues, there are going to be the California Bay Delta, there are going to be issues that soak up everyone's time. The LCC is not the best place for that, but it may be the clearinghouse. It may be the place where every year there's a report out about the important conservation activities going on. So people know what's going on. If they want to get involved more in this one, they will get there. A bit of a clearinghouse, a traffic cop kind of concept. But don't try to do too much. All right, 2 more quick keys for success. Number 4, document your success. We have to show, this is part of the elevator speech, right? We've got to be able to tell people the good things that LCCs are doing. That means, and it may be as simple as, and as profoundly important as, sharing information, sharing data collection, sharing science. That is really important. Let's document that. Let's show how that LCC made connections with the science and efficiently shared scientific resources and data development in a way that didn't happen before in this region. If we can show improved decision-making because of this, all the better. If a federal agency doing a resource management plan, say BLM, or a National Park Service doing a new management plan, can use the LCC to bounce ideas off of it and get some input and make sure that what it's coming out with makes sense with what else is going on in the region, document that. We need to show everyone that the investment, the modest investment that we're making in LCCs is getting us payoff. And by the way, if we can show that this cooperation is actually providing real on-the-ground difference, like helping clear that new wildlife corridor needed because of changing migration patterns, helping to preserve open space, helping to make good adaptation decisions, please document that. Finally, key to success, I think that we need to get everyone around the table to put skin in the game. LCCs will not continue to work if they are viewed as the province of, take your pick, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of the Interior, whatever. LCCs must not have a label on them. They truly must be collaborative with equal measures of state folks, tribal folks, stakeholders, and federal agencies. The only way that's really going to happen is if there's skin in the game by everybody. Doesn't have to be money. It can be high-level participation and contributions of science, et cetera, but we've got to get our LCCs to that place. If we do these things, and we are fully capable of it, I spent some time with most of you LCC coordinators in Seattle 2 or 3 months ago. I came away energized. All of you who are working in LCCs have your heart in it. You see the future. It's exciting. We're filling a void that's needed to be filled. You're on the forefront of conservation. This is the time to take advantage of what we've been able to build in 3 years and to take it to the next level. I wish you luck, and we're gonna work together to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for those inspiring remarks. Watershed moment. Some challenges, just a few, and some keys to success to think about. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Greg Sukanik, currently the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Deputy Director for Management and Policy. He's been doing that since last July, but he brings to that position a long and distinguished career in the Fish and Wildlife Service. He previously served as Assistant Director for the National Wildlife Refuge System. His current position, he provides strategic program direction, develops policy and guidance to support and promote conservation program development and to fulfill the various missions of the service. If you think that sounds like a lot of Washingtonese, I assure you that he brings to this years of on-the-ground work experience. He's worked in a variety of venues, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Alaska. Greg.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Deputy Secretary Hayes. Good afternoon. What an awesome crowd. You know, every once in a while you start feeling like you've been doing a fair amount of travel, and it was a week and a couple days ago we were in Atlanta for the North American Wildlife and Natural Resource Conference, and when I walked out of the elevator, I saw a group of people that were the exact same group I saw when I left Atlanta, and I thought, oh my God, I've woke up in Atlanta again. So it's very good to be here. I'm, as Roger said, Greg Sakanik. I'm from the Fish and Wildlife Service Stovepipe, and I'm very happy to be entering into the 5-step program of success, as just outlined by Deputy Secretary Hayes. But most importantly, I want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to simply be here and to share some thoughts and to pass on from Director Ash that he would really like to be here. But perhaps the most important message from him is a resounding thank you for the engagement that you have given, the interest, the commitment over the last 2.5 to 3 years towards developing the idea of the landscape conservation cooperatives and putting them actually into play on the lands and within the regions. So we thank you, and I pass that along. Thank you very much. I thought for what I do for a little bit is maybe talk a little bit about our history, and as you can imagine, it's going to be kind of brief. You know, we've only been at this a few years. And I talk a little bit about maybe sort of where we are today, and since we only have those 3 years, you might guess, again, that could probably be fairly brief. And then I might close out a little bit again with what I see as perhaps are some of the challenges, maybe a little bit more related to within the Fish and Wildlife Service and or collectively perhaps agency to agency and so on. So if you start way back in 2010, you know, we were pleased to be able to offer and to start 9 landscape conservation cooperatives. They emerged and they began a process of engaging public and tribal, private, and academic partners to address conservation science challenges that really and truly transcend political and jurisdictional boundaries. This science approach to conservation, whether you call it holistic, collaborative, adaptive, or cooperative, recognizes one primary tenet. You've already heard it several times today, that individual entities acting alone simply cannot meet the challenge of sustainable land, water, and wildlife and cultural resources for generations yet to come. It takes us all. And I look around the room here, I see that we all bring an agenda to the table. We all bring an agenda to the table. And we need to recognize that. But I think what we need to recognize is that that's truly a core strength. What we have already heard earlier today, we are truly poised, and we are looking for what is that sweet spot or that juxtaposition where our agendas overlap and provide us the opportunity to influence a much broader conservation outcome. So your agendas are your strength, but collectively we can deliver a much broader conservation outcome. So, since 2010, we have moved smartly. We've engaged 22 landscape conservation cooperatives, the most recent being the Caribbean, led by the U.S. Forest Service and a variety of partners. The cooperatives already demonstrate a remarkable diversity of partner-based structure, staffing from numerous federal and state agencies, including a shared coordinator with the Florida Wildlife Commission, and staffing arrangements with Tennessee, Washington State, and numerous others. The South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative is hosted in the office of the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. All 50 state fish and wildlife agencies are involved in at least one cooperative, and more than 1/3 of the steering committees are chaired or co-chaired by a state agency leader. Non-governmental organizations and tribes are providing leadership as the cooperatives begin to mature, and our international neighbors, both north and south, are actively engaged. It wasn't long ago I was actually at a North American Protected Area Network meeting, and I had the opportunity to meet Ellen Luttrell, the CEO for Parks Canada. And as we began the meeting in a conversation of protected areas, he actually offered his perspective on landscape conservation cooperatives, and he indicated that in his impression it had the potential to affect conservation on a larger scale than he had ever imagined he would see in his career. In a recent meeting that one you might guess that just happened, I heard a comment by a state wildlife director that this may be the model needed to complement the North American model of conservation that we have looked to so seriously and for so long to fund a lot of our conservation work. Many of you may know I'm a product of what is referred to as the joint ventures. I was very happy early in my career to be able to begin as a project manager for the Chase Lake Prairie Project as part of the Prairie Pothole joint venture. And many of the conversations that we had then are the same conversations that are being had right now. You know, it was organic in nature. There were no rules. There was not a guidebook. There was nothing to be able to pull off the shelf and say, well, this is how you deliver under this kind of a perspective. It was organic, and with organic comes innovation. To begin and to form in ways that you just simply couldn't imagine if you were driving this from a national office top-down approach, which I know all of you absolutely love whenever we send those memos out, and you appreciate that. So, you know, another good example perhaps, the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, working through the regional conservation needs process. They actually dedicate 4% of their state wildlife grant funds, and they expend them to address issues common to the entire Northeast, extending from Virginia to Maine. What an opportunity for the North Atlantic Conservation Cooperative to join an already highly developed resource conservation need perspective to bolster and expand the much-needed strategy that will eventually lead to conservation delivery. The Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. We heard a lot about adaptation this morning. It's an effort of the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies to define the future conservation landscape in the Southeast. And along with that, they will identify the conservation priorities, and they will include focal areas in which to engage in important work. Several Southeast landscape conservation cooperatives are now engaged in this effort in support of the adaptation strategy. They will provide and help guide natural resource managers as they deliver conservation. The East Gulf Coastal Plain and Lower Mississippi joint ventures have come together to articulate a vision for sustainable natural and cultural resources in the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks Landscape Conservation Cooperative. It's happening. It's working. So clearly, there are important collaborative efforts that landscape conservation cooperatives are engaged in and are providing regional science perspectives for that local conservation delivery. And I apologize for not being able to speak to all of the activities that are out there, but I certainly wanted to just highlight a few. So one challenge we face is to continue integrating within the myriad of conservation strategies already in play. Again, we heard some of that this morning. Congress recently recognized the landscape conservation cooperatives need to continue to integrate and recognize the benefit gained through a network of conservation strategies. Development of science and information needs that will inform conservation delivery for bird joint ventures and fish habitat partnerships is really a natural fit for a shared science agenda with cooperatives. The recent National Status Report on the State of Aquatic Resources completed by the National Fish Habitat Action Plan Steering Committee noted the need to develop a much more integrated and operational aquatics information system. Again, a natural fit for consideration within a network of landscape conservation cooperatives. As you already heard a little bit of, the recent plight of sage grouse throughout their range, 11 states, 4 landscape conservation cooperatives, joint ventures, and other initiatives stands as an example of the need to think about the collective conservation issue and opportunities when acting as a true network. We can move the needle, and we can address a common conservation interest and challenge. And more recently, in discussions around the table this morning at breakfast, I understand that there's been progress made in the network perspective, and the steering committee chairs are closing in on vision, mission, and charters to help guide the integration and to help tell our story. And now, if you'll just bear with me for a few minutes here, I think that you already heard a little bit, too, about Thomas Friedman, the author of The World is Flat. And, you know, and I think it's interesting that he describes the flattening of our world in the sense of communications, travel, international markets, and a wide variety of forces acting upon all of us in a manner that connects us in a way that it absolutely demands collaboration and shared solutions. Now, that's from a business perspective. Business now often view themselves as borderless. You think about that. It wasn't that long ago, you had a business that kind of said, well, I might be locally based, I might be regionally based, I might be, tri-state based. But a lot of businesses now with the internet are borderless, worldwide. You couple that with the torrent of social change. Anybody ever imagine they would see an Arab Spring or the Occupy movements? The world is a different place. So I believe this flatter world is changing how we conduct conservation. And I think, as we heard earlier today by Dr. Theobald, landscape conservation cooperatives are really the interplay between science, management, and organization. And I think we would be remiss if we stood by and failed to recognize the need for leadership during these times. No longer can an agency even suggest that it encompasses the entirety of technical and social solutions to solve our conservation challenges. Expertise, information, political influence are all found scattered throughout the conservation community. I see it in this room, and it is our responsibility to create the conversation that best uses these assets in a manner that most effectively delivers the conservation that we all want, we are all after. Another thought from this morning: global thought, regional collaboration, and local action. It's all in play with the landscape conservation cooperatives. So again, we heard, and I'll speak to it briefly, we recognize the complexity around federal, state, and private organization budgets. It's nothing new. But I want you to think for just a moment. Think about our past. Think about the difficulties we encountered, the 30s, the Dust Bowl days, and what came out of those days following the Great Depression, when we created a civilian conservation corps, followed on the heels of 75 national wildlife refuges. No one ever would have imagined that the country would come together around a conservation ideal. Now today, so what's at play? I think we still see a strong collective will of society to support conservation. Think about Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, have all come together to support conservation through what? Through dedicated tax revenues. Conservation fund through dedicated tax revenues that they are willing to pay, and they have passed bond initiatives for local conservation efforts. This, I think, continues to demonstrate the diverse nature of today's funding base and our need to be in sync with all the opportunities before us. It's flatter out there. There's opportunities. We need to know the human dimensions to be able to reach them. So I'll just conclude with maybe a few thoughts, perhaps a little bit more local to the Fish and Wildlife Service, or at least an agency partnership. I think as the cooperatives develop, we need to demonstrate success. There is no other place to turn. We have to come together to influence successful conservation outcomes. We need to tell our story, and we need to tell our story loud. We need to continue working on building capacity so that we can all reap benefits of engaged partnerships. Nothing new, but extremely important. As I heard, I think it was called skin in the game. We need to all be at the table. We need to continue to integrate existing agency strategies, our own agency strategies, whether it be migratory bird management, endangered species, aquatic resource conservation, into the landscape conservation cooperatives where we can and where best supporting. We need to continue to foster liaisons between existing efforts, such as the National Wildlife Refuge System Inventory and Monitoring Network, with the LCC steering committees and operations staff. Attention needs to be paid to other efforts, whether it is in the vital signs networks, the forest inventories, the crucial habitat assessment tools, or climate science centers, to ensure that we have standard monitoring protocols and data management. We can accept no less. We need to expand our efforts to create and support connections and networking within other collaborative strategies, including joint ventures, National Fish Habitat Action Plan, the Western Governors Wildlife Council, and the many other myriad that are out there. We need to continue to look for creative means to help staff efforts, including the use of detail assignments, interagency personnel agreements, internships, and other means to engage a diversity of organizations working to build the cooperatives. We need to use our innovation. We will continue to build on the strong linkage between the cooperatives and state wildlife action plans and the state and tribal wildlife grant funding mechanisms that support continued efforts. We need to work hard to ensure they have those opportunities. And we need and will continue at all levels to encourage our conservation partners to work within the framework of the landscape conservation cooperatives as this forum for collaboration that benefits all of our efforts to deliver conservation for future generations in this much flatter world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. I want to pick up on a couple of your themes here. Strength and diversity, by way of going to our next speaker. Kevin Hunting is Chief Deputy Director of the Department of Fish and Game for the state of California. In this capacity, he's responsible for overall department operations, administration of all department divisions and functions, and assisting the director with issue resolution and policy development. That sounds like a challenging position, Kevin. I've had the great pleasure of working with Kevin as he has served on a steering committee for the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plant Climate Adaptation Strategy. He brings to his current position a whole wealth of experience. He has 25 years of experience in wildlife management, conservation planning, and resource assessment, and I just want to put a plug in here to thank the state of California for being such a leader in thinking about climate change and how it affects the various aspects, including conservation. Kevin.
Thanks very much, and I just want to say it's really a privilege and an honor for me to be here, and look at this turnout. It's a great, excellent turnout at this workshop. Reflecting on a couple of things I heard from the past speakers before I really kind of jump into my presentation, I really appreciate Deputy Secretary Hayes kind of outlining what success looks like in an LCC and what success looks like to the partners that are participating in an LCC. We have no shortage of partnerships in California. I'll get to that in a minute in my slides. Some work, some don't, and it's nice to think in terms of what success means when it comes to partnerships. We have parts of 4 LCCs in California, but I'm going to kind of focus my comments today just on the California LCC, which is I'm on the steering committee of that particular LCC, and most of the work that we're doing in California from a state fish and game, wildlife and fisheries management perspective really interacts with that California LCC. So I thought today what I'd do is just take a couple of minutes and offer up some ideas on what a state's role can be in these partnerships. Skin in the game seems to be kind of the theme for this session, and I think that's key to any of the partnerships that we're involved in, whether it's an advisory group, a stakeholder group, or a kind of true collaborative partnership like an LCC. There has to be some level of investment by everybody for them to work, and I think that's one reason why, at least from my perspective, the California LCC's been a success. So I just wanted to throw this slide up. We do partnerships. Like most state agencies and federal agencies, we're involved in a lot of different partnerships. Our state's undergoing a strategic visioning process right now that has a pretty robust stakeholder group and a lot of input. We also have a pretty wide-ranging and broad climate adaptation stakeholder group that's been advising us. So, back in 2010, when the LCC concept was kind of emerging and discussions were kind of occurring in the conservation community, we said, hey, do we need another partnership? We've got, 20 or 30, and a dozen of them work well, some don't. What's this all about? Dug into things a little bit more, talked to our service regional office, and kind of looked at what LCCs were striving to be. And the model made sense to us, at least from the state perspective. There wasn't really, the model after the joint ventures, of course, I consider those successful in California, but there wasn't really an outlet for this kind of the shared science and delivery of science at a level that is directly consumable by a state agency with trustee responsibilities. In other words, can we take that science and pretty quickly turn it around and get it into some kind of management action on the ground that addresses climate change or reacts to a need that we have on a kind of a regional basis? So the other part that was kind of attractive to us about the LCC concept at the time was, this landscape level look at things, this picture of California through a series of landscape level regions where we felt we had some common threats, some common conservation values, and we were already kind of reacting to those threats and values through our wildlife action plan at that regional scale anyway. So, we jumped in and became part of all the LCCs, but again, in particular the California LCC. Before I move on, one other thing I wanted to mention though is over the last several years, those of you that are in state government are probably sharing the pain. We've been under pretty significant budget reductions for the last 6-7 years in a row, and unfortunately for us, it's kind of gotten to a lot of our pure science programs. A lot of our regulatory programs remain fully funded, other programs like that, but science seems to be a target for budget cuts. So we felt, that we could kind of use the LCC to leverage the good science that's out there under a lot of different umbrellas, to our advantage. At the same time, maybe we could offer from a regional, a state, and a kind of multi-state and national level some policy support, some legislative support, and also some kind of management guidance that we, hoped at least would make the actions of the LCC relevant for us in real time. So it has been a powerful partnership. In the early stages, as the network began to take shape, we saw that there's an opportunity for the LCCs to align nicely with some of our programs, our mandates. We already do a lot of work with the state and federal agencies in California. We interact on a regular basis with the university system and California state system, and we've got a lot of good kind of one-on-one partnerships and project-level partnerships with NGOs and other stakeholders. But there seemed to be kind of an intersection here, at least in our state, where this could come together to address climate change at a landscape level. And we've kind of viewed that we kind of viewed it this way heading into that partnership, and as it's turned out, just in a very short period of time, it's actually kind of borne out to be true, that it does kind of fill that niche that you've heard our previous speakers mention. So, I just wanted to offer a couple of ways, at least in California, and maybe this resonates, maybe it doesn't with some of our other states that are represented here today. I kind of hope it does, but if it doesn't, that's fine. In California, we can bring some awareness and some kind of high-level focus to LCCs through a variety of different means. In California, we've been fortunate enough to have a couple of consecutive administrations that support climate change work and have passed some legislation, issued some executive orders at the governor's level that really kind of signal support for our participation and other state department participation in things like LCCs, in those kinds of partnerships. And we can use that to leverage funding for those. We can, we can use that to leverage the entire partnership. And as a department within the state system, we've developed and set our own kind of policy direction, especially as it relates to climate change. Climate change adaptation strategy. We have a statewide strategy. We have a department-wide vision document, And those send strong signals to the partnerships, and including the LCCs, of kind of the direction that the state's going. But I think that probably the most important thing that we can bring to the table is kind of defining and articulating the management vision for our trustee resources. The state's responsible for the fish and wildlife in California and in any state. And I think if we can bring that to the table as the trustee agency, if we can describe to our partners how we need to manage wildlife, that'll help set some of the priorities for the partnership. And we feel like it could direct kind of some of the science outputs from that partnership in a very tangible and applied way. And as a state agency, that's what we're all about. We need to turn those kinds of science applications into direct kind of management results. So just kind of bumping it up one level, these regional efforts are also, I think, are very important to bring focus to LCCs and other partnerships. I want to give a shout out to the WGA and the Western Governors Wildlife Council for a recent publication on corridors, the Corridor Initiative. And this was originally kind of conceived as part of an effort to look at broad-scale renewable energy transmission planning. But it's being used, I know, for us and in other Western states as a kind of a tool to look at possible corridors for changing habitats in the Western states. So that's been very helpful. And then everybody's aware of the national strategy that's underway for climate adaptation. I'm hoping that provides an overall framework and maybe some common ground for how LCCs operate, especially across the West, my part of the world, but maybe even across the entire U.S. So all of these things, I think, are important ways that states can provide overall direction, can bring to the partnership some leveraging ability, and just be an active participant, even in the face of reduced budgets and kind of reduced personnel, and the capability to bring those kinds of things to the table. So I also just wanted to mention, since I had a captive audience, this recent West Coast Action Plan on Jobs. This is I consider this to be one of the stronger signals I've seen recently. It's a joint document between Canada, Oregon, Washington, and California, under the guise of economic recovery and as far as job development. And it's pretty explicit about using LCCs and climate science centers as a vehicle for green economy and supporting science in a positive way, at least across the West Coast. So I was really happy to see this, and I think this is the kind of thing that also at kind of the state level we can do to support these partnerships. So just to briefly summarize, I'm hoping that the states see their way clear, again, along this theme of skin in the game, to participate at the steering committee level. And I was happy to hear some of the statistics that you mentioned, Greg, about the level of state participation in other LCCs, and that's a very tangible way we can operate. Providing this conservation and management vision to the LCCs as the trustee resource agency, as the state agency, I think is also critical, so that we can use that as one way to guide the science that's coming out of the process. Identify and support mutually beneficial guidance and policies. So because we have state and federal agencies at the table, and NGOs, tribal community, and others, I mean, the idea of joint policies or joint guidance documents or some level of agreement on how we develop policy, I think, is important and a useful outcome of the LCCs. Participating in priority decisions related to applied science, I mentioned that before, and then just providing the support and science and management expertise that reside within a state agency. I know in our agency we have pockets of pretty intensive research around things like the Bay Delta, recovering some of the species in the Bay Delta area of California. We're doing a major river system recovery, San Joaquin River recovery program in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley in our state, working actively on the Klamath program. So, we have some expertise in applying science and management in that arena. So I want to close with a couple of things. I'm going to throw this in based on a conversation I had on a conference call a little earlier this morning. We have a tendency, at least in California, to chain our headquarters staff to their desk. And And in the face of budget reductions, they end up doing things that, you know, at the end of the day, they go home and say, what did I really get done today? And there's plenty of days that I admit I feel like that. It's part of the state bureaucracy system. I'm sure our federal partners can relate to that. But, you know, within a period of a year, we set some priorities through the LCC, generated some ideas, and we now have a series of species-level vulnerability assessments that we can directly plug into our ongoing wildlife action plan updates. So it's a very tangible way that you know, the LCCs have produced, that partnership has produced in a relatively short period of time, especially compared to some of the other partnerships we have in California. Produced something very tangible, very useful, and as Deputy Secretary Hayes said, you know, relevant. It's today's work, and it has relevance in our management today. So I'll leave you with what is now probably one of the most famous cartoons on climate change. Joel Pett did this several years ago. And, you know, climate change science, climate change policy is not without controversy. I happen to live in a state where we have a couple of administrations that have supported, through legislation, work that's been done, work by their state departments. That's not the case in every state. Everybody knows that. But at the end of the day, it's about making you know, the United States and California a better place to live. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Kevin, not only for those insightful remarks on active state government roles in LCCs, but I think I'm hoping folks wrote that down as a key slogan for the LCCs, a great place to get away. We probably should fill in something on that, otherwise we may not get permission to travel anymore. Get away, make me feel like I'm getting something done, the relevance, powerful. And I just want to comment too on the resiliency, his last comments on continuing to push forward in determination through multiple administrations with multiple views. I think it's an important comment. So our last speaker on this panel is Dr. Gary Morishima. He's technical advisor for natural resource management with the Quinault Indian Nation. He has over 35 years experience in natural resource management, particularly simulation modeling, policy analysis, conflict resolution, and meeting facilitation. He's been CEO of his natural resource consulting firm since 1969. He specializes in providing consulting services to Indian tribes, government agencies, and private industry, particularly in areas related to computer simulation of natural resource management systems. He's authored numerous publications. He's been the recipient of numerous awards. And Dr. Morishima, thank you for your comments.
Well, thank you very much. I am very pleased to be here today to share some thoughts with you. We've heard a lot already about the need for thinking about things in a different way. And with all due respect to some of the things I've already heard today, that many of the things that you folks are talking about have been around for thousands of years, and they've been practiced and viewed by tribal societies, the need to look at humans as part of nature and not apart from nature. Most of my comments today are going to really center upon the need to understand and respect differences in perspective, differences in values, and differences in terms of risk. Working with Indian tribes, I've learned a number of things. First of all, tribes tend to view things in a holistic way, and that's quite a bit different than the way that Western society has come to view resource management issues and problems, where you tend to isolate. I think David called it stovepiping. I call it fragmentation or pigmentation or pixelization. We've also heard a lot about the need to look at different time horizons and look to the future instead of the immediate present. Working with tribal communities, the tribal decisions are made from the basis of 7 generations from now. They're not based upon what's going to happen tomorrow or the week after or next year. They're based upon what the implications are 7 generations from now. And I think in many ways, the concepts and values that you're talking about here at this conference really reflect that. Another thing within working with tribes is that you recognize that change is a part of life, and that the environment is changing, the social conditions are changing, all things are changing, and all things are interrelated to one another. So when you talk about the ability to effect change on the landscape scale, you're really talking about sustaining ways in which we can change our value system and the way that we go about doing business. We've heard a lot about this, at this conference about vision, but in order to make vision become more than just a dream, you have to have the means to attain it. David, in his comments a little while ago, offered up 5 major approaches or strategies to deal with that. But to make a vision become more than just a dream, you have to deal with difficult and troublesome issues that go beyond the realm of just science. You have to deal with values and risk, and those are both socially and culturally determined. If you're going to be able to affect change on the landscape, you have to be able to find a way of overcoming the immediate everyday needs of the pocketbook, high gas prices, the healthcare debate right now and before the Supreme Court, and find a way to overcome that so that everybody can embrace a vision and act upon that. You have to be able to embrace a vision that's larger than what you see if you focus on your personal perspective and viewpoint. And you have to have a vision that's going to embrace the needs of all of society, all colors, all races, all income levels, in order to be able to affect that change. Well, I talked a little bit about fragmentation, and I'm going to use the analogy of pixels. For those of you who are into computers, you recognize that a pixel is the smallest unit that you can control. A pixel is a small point on a computer screen, if you will, of 1080p by 1024p. But each one of those points is controlled by 3 colors: blue, red, and green. And depending upon the intensity of each one of those colors, you get a different color. If you combine all 3 of them at 100%, you get white. If you don't use any of them at all, you get black. And you get all the colors in between by being able to control that. But we've become pixelized in our thinking. This is a picture of Lolo National Forest in Montana and Idaho. And you can see the checkerboard ownership pattern. Decisions are made on a landscape scale, but they're made in this kind of an environment where your interactions have to be taken into account with the interactions of your neighbors. We've been pixelized in terms of our land ownership patterns, our land allocation strategies, the agencies that we employ to manage and make decisions on our behalf, by judicial jurisdictions, by political boundaries, by economic forces, by single species management. We've been pixelized temporally too. So we're not just talking about decisions of today, we're talking about having to overcome pixelization so that we can think about tomorrow and the years to come. Becoming pixelized has an effect on the way that we think and the way that we approach decisions in natural resource management. We've become accustomed to making decisions within the confines of ownership boundaries. That leads to isolation, fragmentation, and compartmentalization. It means that amenities are gained or lost on the landscape that have no direct bearing or relevance to an immediate decision by an individual on a pixel basis. So the question is, how do we keep from what we want falling off the landscape in this kind of environment? I also represent the Intertribal Timber Council. I'm on the executive board and have been since the Intertribal Timber Council was formed in 1976. But the Intertribal Timber Council is undertaking a study called Anchor Forests. I'm not going to get too much into that right now. I think that the important thing to recognize is that with Anchor Forests, we don't focus on the individual pixel, whether to color it green, red, or blue. Instead, we talk about the functions that need to be sustained. the ecosystems, the societies that have to be sustained on the landscape. From an Indian tribe's perspective, all things are connected, and it's important to keep that in mind when tribes are looking at this issue of landscape conservation cooperative. When you work at a pixel, an individual pixel doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a single color. And pixels, in order to begin to make sense, have to be put together in order to begin to see the picture. So once the picture conformed, in order to get the picture, you have to have some leadership, and you have to have the ability to see how one pixel relates to all the others in order to understand how things need and have to work together. Nobody knows more, and nobody has experienced more the problems and challenges that pixelization causes. Native Americans once managed this land for many thousands of years, but within the last 300 years, the tribal presence on the land has been diminished. Most tribes were relocated onto small reservations, so instead of having access to all the land and all the resources within their environs, they were relegated to small reservation homelands. This has had tremendous problems for tribes in terms of fragmentation of their economic structures, fragmentation of their political influence, fragmentation of the ecological functions upon which they depended upon. It's also wreaked havoc upon cultures. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking about history's lessons and some of the things that tribes have learned. Tribes have experienced a long history of suffrage, eviction from their homelands, and expropriation of resources others have coveted. That's all been made in the name of progress and individual economic development. We are sitting at a situation where resources on Indian lands could become very important considerations as climate change, energy security and independence, and landscape scale management come to the forefront. And tribes, because of their experiential history, are going to be wary of many of these new initiatives that come along the block. They will see Landscape Conservation Cooperative as another potential way in which the ability of tribes to continue to access and utilize the resources that are essential to sustain their communities might be affected. It's important to recognize that Indian tribes are sovereigns, that Indian lands are not public lands, but they're private lands that are held in trust for Indian beneficiaries. There are about 56 million acres of Indian lands that are held in trust for individuals and tribes in the continental United States. There's another 44 million acres of lands that are held by Alaska Native corporations, so in total, about 100 million acres in the United States are subject to tribal management and utilization. As sovereign governments, tribes have the right to self-determination. They have the right to operate their own programs, and many tribes do operate very significant and substantial innovative programs for natural resource management. But tribes have to operate those programs within the confines of something called the Federal Trust Responsibility, where tribal actions and decisions are subject to approval and authorization by the Department of Interior. But tribes are very jealous. They are very territorial of their sovereign rights and their ability to manage their rights and the lands. What does that mean? Well, tribes are sovereigns. They have to be substantive participants. They've got to be consulted on a government-to-government basis during the formulation and implementation of policy. And many tribes, being place-oriented, being restricted to the lands and their reservations, are extremely sensitive and uniquely impacted by climate change and landscape scale management. I mentioned fiduciary trust obligations. But because the Indian lands are held in trust for the tribal beneficiaries, the lands have to be managed in the best interests of those beneficiaries. The public policy objectives have to be subordinate to the protection of those fiduciary obligations, and the regulations and restrictions that could potentially diminish the ability of tribes or the value of the trust corpus cannot be imposed without raising potential issues of taking for public purposes. Tribes, being one of the most socially disadvantaged communities in the United States, their involvement in issues of climate change also raise issues relating to social justice. The tribal communities are among the most vulnerable to the effects of climate and landscape level changes. This has been recognized by the panel on climate change. And many place-oriented tribes, because they're restricted on reservation boundaries and resource availability at specific times and places, means that their lifeways, their cultures, their foods and medicines are all going to be affected by what goes on around them. Some adaptation strategies that you've seen happen by some of the animals, for example, that move from place to place as conditions are no longer suitable. Tribes don't have that option. They are restricted to their homelands and have to have the ability to continue to access and utilize those resources upon which their cultures and economies depend. And Indian tribes are going to be skeptical. They're going to be wary of any attempts to displace environmental costs upon them without their free, prior, and informed consent. This has been a problem within tribal communities, particularly with impacts of laws like the Endangered Species Act, where tribes are the reservation homelands, because they're managed on a different basis, are becoming refuges for species that are being driven from other parts of the land. So the bottom line message I want to give you is don't forget about tribes. Don't marginalize tribes. Tribes have an immense diversity, a rich culture, and history of relationships with the land. And don't forget as well that this cultural diversity and biological diversity are very closely intertwined. Here's a little side-by-side of tribal groupings and landscape conservation cooperatives. I was struck by this because, as I understand it anyway, the origin of the boundaries of your landscape conservation cooperatives go to migratory bird conservation units and those sorts of things. But if you look at the tribal groupings on the left here, you'll notice that there seems to be, to me at least, a rather remarkable similarity in terms of the configuration of the landscape conservations and the configuration of tribal groups and tribal societies. And this shouldn't be surprising because of the close interdependence of tribes with their environment. It also shouldn't be surprising because of the close connection between language and culture. That language provides cultural continuity. It provides order and relationships between people and the environment. It's got the genesis, evolution, adaptation, observation, communication, social interaction, and delineation of difference are all dealt with through language. The framework for understanding is based upon place and time. And it's also based upon a categorical and systemic taxonomy that may not coincide with that used by Western science, but it is valid within the tribal communities and tribal cultures. This is a graphic that I put together in terms of trying to compare the major differences in thinking and knowing between Indian tribes and Indian cultures and that of Western science. I'm not going to go through this in a whole lot of difference, but I think of detail. But I think it's quite important to understand that these two perspectives are both valid, and that you shouldn't discount tribal knowledge, tribal traditional knowledge, because you don't see it published somewhere in a peer-reviewed journal. To tribes, that knowledge is at least as valid and as relevant to the decisions confronting you as those that you will find in any refereed journal. So what are the opportunities in working with tribes? The first is with biological diversity. Monitoring and management. Imagine, if you would, the potential value of having 565 tribes or reservations around the country as permanent homelands, permanent places where observation and information can be collected over time. Now, that's a huge potential value to the Landscape Conservation Initiative. Tribal communities also have multi-generational experience and observation so that they can see things that are going on within their environments that may escape the attention of monitoring programs or scientists that come in and visit once in a while. They will see things going on and changes that are occurring that are important to understand. They may not know why they're occurring, but they will certainly observe that they are occurring and what the potential impacts of those changes might be upon the resources that they have come to depend upon. They also notice things like changes in ecological functions, the changes in terms of when the rain falls, when the flowers bloom, when the berries come, when the fish arrive. They've also seen invasive species and how invasive species are coming to affect their resources and the values that those resources provide. But Indian tribes are managers and their potential partners, that they have a wealth of experience and resource stewardship that crosses thousands of years. Tribes have accumulated that traditional knowledge and sensitivities to their environment because they are tied to place and because they live intimately with the resources within their local environments. Tribes are among the first to notice major changes in ecological processes, and many tribes have very sophisticated natural resource management programs and information that could inform and be of significant value as you attempt to address the challenges that you face in your landscape conservation cooperatives. Tribal partners, permanence, dependence on natural resources, commitment to stewardship and sustainable use, experience adapting to change, and tribes have as well reserved rights that I haven't really touched upon, but many tribes, besides living on their reservation homelands, have rights to hunt, fish, and gather resources off of the reservations within their traditional territories. Opportunities for partnership are intellectual, they're practical and economic, they're environmental, relating to stewardship, they're biological and cultural, and they're political as well. Because in order to affect change on the landscape, you have to contend with the whole bag. You can't limit yourself to just science alone, because many of the actions and decisions in order to affect change have to be institutionalized. And you have to overcome those barriers that are going to stand in the way of the ability to achieve conservation at the landscape scale. Indian tribes, what do they offer? A long history of historic stewardship, contemporary expertise in emerging social, ecological, and economic issues. They've got expertise in the integration of processes, disciplines, and funding to resolve complex multi-resource value and jurisdictional landscape scale management. This is becoming more and more apparent in various parts of the country where tribes and tribal involvement have been instrumental in the ability to overcome differences among various user groups between government agencies in order to find common ground and be able to move forward. Well, what do tribes need? They need to ensure that they have a place at the table. They need to be involved and engaged in government-to-government consultation and substantive participation in the development of policy objectives and initiatives regarding things like climate change and landscape scale management. There should be a recognition of the need to respect and reciprocal sharing of knowledge and expertise and information from both the science world as well as the tribal world. And they need to have the ability to participate in monitoring and contribute their knowledge and experience to this broader issues that society as a whole face. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Gary. We have run into our Q&A time, and I know that there's a coffee break now, so I'm actually looking for one of the organizers to see. I think most of the speakers are going to be here through the meeting. I encourage you to bring your questions forward to them, catch them during coffee or mealtime. And if you would join me, please, in thanking the speakers for this round of presentations.